Hello everyone, I'm Daniel, an undergraduate student in archaeology. Today I'll be interviewing Dr. Rachel Opitz, whom I have worked with in the past at the site of Gabii in Italy, about 3D imaging and how it applies to her work at Gabii. After completing her PhD degree in archaeology at the University of Cambridge, Dr. Opitz is now senior lecturer in spatial archaeometry in University of Glasgow's School of Humanities, specializing in landscape archaeology and 3D and digital applications in archaeology. She co-leads the excavation project at Gabii, where she co-edited the book A Mid-Republican House from Gabii, and has also written numerous papers and book sections on 3D imaging, remote sensing, and geometric analysis. Dr. Opitz, thank you for joining me for this interview. Why don't we start by explaining what is 3D imaging?
Sure, and thank you for inviting me to talk about this with you today. So 3D imaging is a technique that does what it says on the tin. You take images, and by pooling the geometric information that's contained in a bunch of different images that are taken from different angles, different positions, you are able to produce 3D models that either visually capture the appearance of an object or a scene, or depending on if you include a scale object, you can produce what I would call a metric 3D model, so one that you can actually use to take measurements. 3D imaging is really the technique or set of techniques that can be used to work your way from a two-dimensional photographic type image to a three-dimensional model.
Does 3D imaging then have a long history? And what was the need in archaeology that prompted archaeologists like you to adopt 3D imaging as part of their analysis?
To answer your first question, this technique has a really quite long history, so we could really take the practice of getting 3D models from images back to stereo pairs of aerial photographs. And if you dig into the history books about the work that air photo interpreters were doing in the First and Second World War, you will find people looking at the landscape and putting together pairs of images with lots of overlap and getting them into a position that made a visual 3D model of the landscape pop out. This is not a new technique by any means. Now, archaeologists have also been interested in 3D modeling and 3D information for a long time. And again, this has a deep history. If you think about the use of contour maps in archaeology, and if you even think about the combination of drawing sections and plans in the context of an excavation, we've been interested in the 3D shape of the landscape. So this is a long-standing interest in archaeology because we know that deposits stratify, that people experience the world in 3D, that objects are 3D. We have lots of reasons as archaeologists to be interested in this as a type of data.
What kind of questions then does 3D imaging help answer in archaeology?
3D imaging has lots of uses in archaeology. This is one of the complicated things when we think about it. I tend to group the use of 3D image-based models into three broad categories. Broad category one, we use 3D imaging for documentation purposes, for recording. And if you think about the work that we do with 3D imaging at Gabii, this is one of the basic things that we do. We all know the saying that archaeology is the unrepeatable experiment. Archaeology as a profession, therefore, puts a lot of emphasis, and rightly so, in documenting the stratigraphy before we remove it and take it away forever. 3D modeling has a really big role to play in that kind of basic documentation. The second thing that 3D imaging gets used for is archaeological storytelling. And this again is something that I think we do a lot of at Gabii. So we have worked very hard to integrate the 3D image-based models into our publications and to really use them as part of how we present the site to other archaeologists, to students, and to the general public. This is something that I talk about as storytelling that is not just a story like a made-up story, but storytelling that's actually embedded in our data, embedded in what we observe, embedded in what we think we know about the past. And so really making very clear and explicit links between a representation of what we see when we're on site, which is that 3D model that captures every single stratigraphic unit that we lovingly make the image-based models of. And these high-level stories that we're telling about the past, that's a big component of what people do with 3D models now. They use them to do this visual storytelling work and to do it in a way that's embedded in data and embedded in what we can observe. The third thing that I think we do broadly in archaeology with 3D modeling, which is probably the least common application, but is one that I think is quite interesting, is we use it for analysis of the shape of the surface of things or the volumetric 3D shape of things. Image-based modeling is a really amazing data source for doing both of these things, for measuring 3D shape of objects in the volumetric shape sense and for measuring the 2.5 to 3D shape of the surface of an object. That is that third area, which in archaeology is often referred to as morphometrics, which morpho, shape, metrics, measure, so measuring the shape of things. And so there's a really interesting research area, mostly to date focused on the shape of artifacts and a little bit zooarchaeological specimens, but there's a really interesting area that I think is going to expand using 3D imaging to investigate how we can use the shape of more diverse things to think about the past.
You have talked a lot about the importance of landscape in archaeology. But when people think about the field, what first comes into their minds are probably artifacts and impressive architecture, not the surrounding landscape and environment. So what is then the value of thinking about landscapes in general, as well as in an excavation context, for archaeological analysis and storytelling?
So we can take the landscape scale question for a moment and then we'll maybe come back to the stratigraphic scale question. I think they're related in that the shape of the landscape at a very large scale is the result of a combination of natural and anthropogenic processes. Humans physically reshape the landscape. If you think about the history of agriculture, we are literally physically reshaping the surface of the earth. And then there are lots of natural processes that also impact on the visibility of the archaeology and that impact on where humans choose to live and how that changes over time. So all of these complex dynamics, both human and environmentally driven, are captured in the shape of the surface of the earth. And if you approach 3D imaging based models of the shape of the surface of the earth or laser scanning based models equally, and you are studying in detail that morphology and you bring expertise from a geomorphological perspective or a geoarchaeological perspective, you can really understand at a large scale a lot about how these processes are playing out. So 3D imaging at the landscape scale has an important role to play in documenting and recording and making available for study that kind of information. Now, if we think about what is happening at the scale of an excavation, so at some place like Gabii, and we're thinking about the shape of these different deposits, the shape of our stratigraphy, the shape of features as we go, these are also the result of a combination of environmentally and anthropogenically driven processes. All of these things that are happening are ultimately captured, in part at least, in the shape of the deposits that we find afterwards. Looking at those shapes with an archaeological eye really lets us to pick apart what the processes are that we think happened in the past. A classic example of how we think about the shape of a deposit in an excavation context and what that specific shape might tell us about past human activity is a midden. So we all know what a midden is. It's a big garbage dump and people use them over time. If you were to say, okay, I'm interested in whether or not everyone came to one place on one side of the dump and it was getting filled in from one side, or if people were coming from lots of different directions and everyone was dumping in from different sides, the answer to that question lies in the shape and the relationship between these different deposits that we look at and study and understand in detail through techniques and through data from sources like image-based modeling. These are all things that we really get by with an archaeological eye, studying the morphology, studying the shape of landscapes and deposits.
Academia has long been criticized for being its own thing and disconnected from the rest of society. In what ways then can 3D imaging improve the accessibility and public understanding, and therefore also public interest of our field?
I think 3D modeling and 3D imaging has a really big role to play here. And there are a couple of ways that we can think about this. One thing that 3D imaging does is it gives really direct access to the broader public of exactly the evidence that we as archaeologists are using. And there is an enormous difference between me sitting here trying to describe to you a scrappy bit of soil that I looked at on site one sunny July morning, and me being able to actually show you the 3D model of that thing in a way where you can turn it around and look at it and investigate how large it is and what its shape is and what the color of the deposit is and all of the information that you get from the 3D model. There is a very simple but serious thing that happens when you make that thing that you have observed available to the broader public and you say, okay, you now can look at what I was looking at. That is important in and of itself in a couple of ways, one of which is just creating this culture of openness, just the simple act as researchers, as archaeologists, of saying we are going to make the effort to make as much of what we observe available to everyone as possible is a culture shift in terms of the relationship between the archaeologist as expert and the broader public who we are communicating with about what it is we see, what we've observed, and why we've made the interpretations we've made. This is really a core question, right? Experts and their expertise. How do we know what we know, and why should you as a member of the public believe what we are saying? Being able to show the 3D imaging data that represents the thing you were looking at when you made an expert interpretation does help to back that interpretation and also to give the impression of a slightly more transparent process. There is a very serious thing there around just that culture of openness and of showing your work, which is increasingly embedded in archaeological practice. And I think, to be honest, 3D imaging has been a motivating factor in pushing that forward because it makes it so much more possible to do in a really rich way. A second thing that I have been thinking about recently in relation to this is how you create a sense of presence. And these image-based models really trick your brain into that sense of presence because you can interact with them. And interactivity is a really powerful driver in generating this sense of presence. So when you have the 3D model, it's not like a photo. With the photo, you look at the photo, you can't really do very much with it. With the 3D models, the image-based modeling approaches, what do you do when you have one of those? You rotate it. You scale it. The gut instinct when you have one of these models is that you interact with it, and that interaction, even if it's not in a real 3D space, your brain interacts with that thing as if you're interacting with a 3D thing. That generates that sense that you are really there with the object. That sense of presence that's generated by the interactivity really allows you to immerse yourself in the idea of the experience of archaeology, and that generates all sorts of interesting human connections with the practice of archaeology rather than the results. It's that spending time observing from multiple angles, trying to understand the relationships between things, bit of the archaeological process that is communicated really well through 3D imaging.
I think we have time for just one more question. So to finish up this interview, in what direction do you think 3D imaging will go in the future, and how do you think it will further impact archaeology as a field?
One thing that 3D imaging will, I hope, do is become a norm for documentation, much as photography is now. I hope we will hit a point where it is easy enough to do the 3D imaging work that to not do it would be bad practice. And that's our attitude towards photography now. Something else that it is perhaps starting to prompt us to do is to be a bit more critical about some of our practices that are really deeply embedded in the discipline as standard practices. If we take the publication of catalog or the publication of excavation reports as two examples of disciplinary practice that I would argue became static in the sense that there was a fixed set of conventions. The increasing use of 3D imaging is starting to get us to critically reflect on those practices and to think about what we might want to change. In our work at Gabii, we have embedded the interactive model of the stratigraphy and the reconstructions in our books about the site. And so when you go to read our book about the Tinku house, which is the house we excavated in Area B at Gabii, and hopefully future volumes that are forthcoming, you are encountering our experiment with the excavation report, which is, again, the excavation monograph. The excavation report is a really canonical form of publication. It's something that has a very standard way of being done that we have started to experiment with, largely prompted by our work with 3D imaging, because we are using these 3D image-based models to do a lot of our interpretation. We want to share that interpretive process, that interpretive practice with our readers. How can we go about doing that? And that led to a whole lot of experimentation and work in the design of the Gabii publications. So I think that's really quite an important thing, that it's pushing us to be quite critical about bits of archaeological practice that had gotten really embedded into the infrastructure of how we work and what we do.
I think that is all the time we have. Thank you again, Dr. Opitz, for this interview and for your insight into 3D imaging.
You're very welcome. Thank you for asking me. And I hope that we will get to see you again at some happy future point back at Gabii.